I will introduce our psychedelic speaker this evening. Dr. Jerry Brown is an anthropologist, author, and activist. From 1972 to 2014, he was founding professor of anthropology at Florida International University in Miami, where he designed and taught a course on hallucinogens and culture. The course examines the use of psychoactive plants by tribal and classical cultures, including ancient India and Greece, and by modern mind explorers, the psychonauts of the 20th century. Dr. Brown is co-author of the Psychedelic Gospels, the history of hallucinogens in Christianity, and also co-author of Sacred Plants and Gnostic Church, Speculations on Entheogen Use in Early Christian Ritual. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited tonight to introduce you to Dr. Jerry Brown. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's been kind of a wild morning. I had to leave our home because of the smoke and ash from the fires, and I thought I'd be able to access the webinar from there, but all of the cell towers are overloaded, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, here we are. So hello, thank you so much, Bradley, for inviting me for this very appropriate talk with the Christmas season coming up. Because what I'd like to do is tell you and your guests the true story of Santa, the Siberian reindeer herder shaman. This is not kind of, for those of you who remember the Cheech and Chong skit, the fantasy comedic skit about Santa and his reindeer and how he sprinkled the magic dust on the reindeer and got them all around the world in one night. That's not that story. This is really the story that we understand it as based on the research that we did for our book, The Psychedelic Gospels, The Secret History of Hallucinogens in Christianity. And what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about the star of our show, the dramatic Amanita muscaria mushroom. We're going to talk about the Amanita fly agaric, the other name for it, reindeer herder complex that has existed in Siberia for literally thousands and thousands of years. And then we're going to explain how every modern meme, every theme of our modern story of Santa Claus is based on the Siberian reindeer herder archetypes and the reality of their searching for and gathering and drying and harvesting and taking the Amanita muscaria mushroom as a portal to the supernatural world, which was the key to shamanism wherever it was practiced. I'd like to start off, if I may, with a little quote from our book, from the chapter Santa, the Reindeer Herder. And this is set in Siberia about 2,000 years BC. On Christmas Eve, when the streets are all covered with snow and a hush falls over the land, parents recite the story of Santa Claus to wide-eyed children. They discreetly wink as they tell the time-worn tale of a jolly old elf who is dressed all in red and white from his head to his toes. Miraculously, Santa travels around the world in one night in a sleigh pulled by flying reindeer, stopping at each home to place gifts under the Christmas tree, festively decorated in tinsel and colorful ornaments with a star near the top. How improbable, how curious. But what if this snow white lie, which we dutifully recount each year, about this time of year, was grounded in an ancient reality whose roots reach back thousands of years to the vast boreal forests of Siberia? What if the real story of Santa was even stranger than that of the commercial myth of Saint Nick, the little sleigh driver so lively and quick? What if it was stranger than most of us could ever imagine? Well, I would imagine for an audience that is part of the Toronto and the other psychedelic societies, perhaps it's not stranger than you can imagine. This story really came into focus during my and Julie, my wife and co-author, and the reason our book is so readable is because of her incredible research and editorial skills combined with mine, was that we had many synchronistic experiences along our travels that confirmed for us at each turn that we were on the right track in following the trail of psychedelics back through history and into Christian art. For example, we were in Scotland, and we came to the Cairngorms Mountains, which are the highest mountains in Scotland. And as we pulled into a small town and asked the innkeeper, what should we do while we're here? She said, you know, you should really visit the Cairngorms Reindeer Center. So the next day after breakfast, we drove up to the Cairngorms Reindeer Center and joined a group of people in a caravan that went up into the mountains. And then we parked, and then we put on these Wellington boots. And then we traipsed up through mud and through streams until we came to a wide plateau. And this is an area where the only wild reindeer herd outside of Eurasia exists. It was brought there many, many years ago by a Scandinavian person who said, this reminds me of the reindeer environment from back home. Our two guides, one of them's name was Beth, and she starts bellowing. And it felt very strange to be standing on this plateau surrounded by forests and hear her bellowing. And she was calling the reindeer. And all of a sudden, one by one, they started filing out of the forest in a single file, the first one with gigantic antlers swaying back and forth until there was a whole group of reindeer, calves, females, males, coming over to us. Our other guide, who carried up a bag of pellets of food for the reindeer, started giving us the pellets and said, go up to a reindeer, hold out your hand, and allow them to eat from it. You can pet them. Unlike American deer that we're used to in North America, they're not afraid of you. They're used to being around people, but don't touch their antlers, because their antlers grow very rapidly. And they're very sensitive, especially at this time of year. So here we are, and I went up to this large bull, and just the magical moment of having that wonderful creature nibbling the food out of my hands. And my wife, Julie, was looking at this kind of albino reindeer that was standing over the side and not coming over to anyone. And she said to the guide, why is he over there? Who's that? And the guide said, oh, that's Circus. He's the Timothy Leary of reindeer. All of the reindeer love Amanita, which their main food is lichen, which grows profusely up here. But they also love the Amanitas, and when they're in season, they go wild for them. They gorge themselves. But Circus loves Amanitas so much that he feeds on them, and he stands there glaring into the sun. And that's why his face is blotched. And she says he never joins the herd. Well, at that moment, he walks over to Julie and looks up into her eyes, and Julie holds out her hands to Circus, and he starts nibbling the food from her hands. Had a moment with her, and then joined the other reindeer as they went away. And we were all walking in sort of a cone of silence at this experience, because we were with about 10 or 12 other people who had joined us. And Julie said, I kind of feel like St. Francis of the Animals. I mean, I don't know why Circus came over to me, but it was a real insight into the connection between reindeer and Amanita that is the key to this story. And that kind of experience reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite people, Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, who said, I don't believe people are looking for the meaning of life as much as they are looking for the experience of being alive. And it was in moments like this, and we had, fortunately, several of them during our research journey, where we felt so alive. We felt we were onto discovering something valuable. And perhaps some of you can relate to this idea of this feeling of aliveness based on your own explorations with psychedelics. And I feel so much gratitude to be so much a part of this conversation that's going on in the psychedelic renaissance, because like all of you, I'm a leaf on a great cosmic tree of psychedelics that has vast and ancient roots. So our story today is about this gentleman, Santa. This is a photo of Santa Claus taken from a storefront. And as you can see, even in modern times, he's accompanied by the red and white dotted Amanita muscaria mushroom. And you can see the little face of the reindeer peeking out. And why is Santa depicted this way? Well, I'd like to go over and talk a little bit about the star of our show. And that is the magnificent Amanita muscaria mushroom in the family of Amanitas. Not to be confused with Amanita phalloides, which is one of the most deadly toxins in the fungal world, or even Amanita rosala, also known as the sickener. And unfortunately, there's about 200 kids, who read about this in courses or see this iconic mushroom, and they go out and explore it in the Rockies, where it definitely grows in the Canadian and American Rockies, and they end up having their stomachs pumped. And that's the best case, because Amanita phalloides can literally kill you. But not with Amanita muscaria. There are no known deaths from Amanita muscaria poisoning. You've seen it in Scandinavian folk tales. You've seen it in Christmas displays. I've had people on our Facebook page tell us that they've heard about it, or their Norwegian grandmother has Christmas tree decorations with these mushrooms in it. It is also
right?
the stone. Yes.
That was it's supposed to be the famous Holy Grail was actually a reference to the Amanita muscaria, if I'm not mistaken. I read in your book there as well.
Well, that is also one of the possible interpretations of it. And when the Amanita, so what you're seeing here, it comes out, it's all encased in a white veil. And that veil grows back, peels back, and that gives you the white popcorn effect around, or the white spotted effect. And here's a mature Amanita, and then it grows even broader, and it turns a kind of tawny yellow orange, and then it curves upward. And here's where Clark Heinrich has suggested that it was also the Holy Grail. It is certainly the Soma of the Hindu Rig Veda. And in the Hindu Rig Veda, the Amanita is praised as having a plant, but a strange plant indeed. It has no branches, it has no roots, it has no trunk, it has no visible seeds. It grows in a mycorrhizal, which means a symbiotic relationship with the conifers and birches. And in its taxonomy, you can see it has, well, you can't see the bulb. You can see maybe the remains of the bulb. It has the veil, which is here. Underneath it has gills that are white or cream colored. And it can grow to about 8 or 9 inches high. As far as Amanita is concerned, in terms of its hallucinogenic properties, it has epotenic acid, but more importantly, it has muscimol, which is the main psychoactive agent. And when it's dried, the epotenic acid converts into muscimol, which is 4 or 5 times more potent in the dried form. Uniquely, among the psychedelics, whether we're talking about peyote or psilocybin or ayahuasca, muscimol does not metabolize well in the body. And here you get one of the most cultural relativistic phenomena, where people talk about that the reindeer love to drink the urine of a human who's taken Amanita, or the reindeer herders keep urine in a sealskin bag to attract and keep their herds around them. And even in the Rig Veda, there's, which is in, part of it is in praise of Soma, there's a passage where Indra comes pissing Soma, pissing it out day by day, like a stag, you have assumed your most mighty force. And this revolves one of the most enigmatic riddles of Soma in the Hindu Rig Veda, which was written down in the Sanskrit about 3,500 years ago, that the Soma could be eaten, the juice of the Soma could be drunk, or someone could drink the urine of someone who had ingested the Soma and also be transported into other realms. And what kind of realms were we talking about? Well, the experience of Soma was quite dramatic, as reported in the Rig Veda. There are passages that say, and we have to remember that the priests of the Rig Veda were talking about something that everyone knew about. So they described it in flowery language. And some of the passages say, I can pick up the earth and put it here or there. Have I been drinking Soma? Heaven does not equal 1/2 of me. Have I been drinking Soma? Or we could go to the most famous passage of the Rig Veda that I'll paraphrase that says, we have drunk the Soma, we have come to the light, we have met the gods. What can the mortality do to us now? Oh, immortal Soma. So this was quite a phenomenal discovery. And what really started off our research was, and we'll come back to the Holy Grail, was in 2006, during an anniversary trip to Scotland, Julie and I went to Rosslyn Chapel. We were drawn there by Dan Brown's bestseller book and film, The Da Vinci Code, which saw Rosslyn Chapel, a Catholic church about 7 miles south of Edinburgh, as a possible final resting place of the Holy Grail, which in this case was the remains of Mary. And Rosslyn Chapel is unique in Christendom in that it is a synthesis created in the 15th century of pagan and Catholic symbolism. And there are about 100 green men in Rosslyn Chapel, and this one stares down prominently from the ceiling. And I bought a plaster replica of this green man, and about 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a restaurant in Scotland, and I turned it upside down, or 180 degrees on the table, and I saw an Amanita muscaria sculpted into the forehead of this green man. There was the bulb, there was the veil, and there was the cap with the dots prominent upon it. Years later, when Julie and I were writing this book, we had the honor of having dinner with Paul Stamets, one of the world's most famous mycologists. And I said to Paul, do you agree with our identification of the mushroom in the forehead of the green man of Rosslyn as a psychedelic Amanita mushroom? He said, it is a taxonomically correct Amanita. And then I made the mistake of saying to Paul, well, are you sure? And that's kind of like asking the Pope if he's Catholic. And Paul laughed and he pulled out his computer and he said, yes, I am sure because I've been to Rosslyn. Here are my photographs of that green man. And let me show you the other mushroom images that I found at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. Well, this discovery in 2006 really set Julie and my head spinning. Back in 1974, I had my first LSD experience at a rainbow family gathering high in the Rocky Mountains. And it really was a phenomenal Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda-like experience. And as an anthropologist, I wanted to learn more, much more about psychedelics. So I designed a course called Hallucinogens in Culture at that time, put it into the catalog as a credited anthropology course. It's still being taught today at Florida International University in Miami. But in the process, I had to learn a lot about ethnobotany. I had to learn about mycology. I had to learn about theology, about art history. And these questions that we had from discovering the Green Man at Rosslyn, they wouldn't go away. What were these questions? Why did Sir William Sinclair, the founder and designer of Rosslyn Chapel, put a psychedelic mushroom into a Catholic church? Is he trying to tell us that this was practiced in the Catholic rituals of his time? Are there possibly other psychedelic mushroom images, specifically Amanita muscaria and psilocybin, in Christian art? Could this even go back to the time of Jesus and the disciples? Is it even possible, remotely possible, that Jesus could have achieved a sense of divinity, a sense of his healing powers, a sense of immortality, in the same way that the practitioners of the Rig Veda did through ingesting psychoactive substances? I mean, in some circles, this would be heresy, and certainly, at very least, it was controversial. And before our minds raced away into a rambunctious overthrow of reason, the words of Carl Sagan, the famous astrophysicist, came to mind. And Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And if we're going to make a claim that Christianity has a psychedelic history, we better be sure to go out and gather compelling, irrefutable evidence. So it was in 2012 that Julie and I traveled through Europe and the Middle East, visiting chapels, cathedrals, churches, and abbeys, and documenting through original photographs from these early Christian and medieval Christian churches the presence of psychedelics in frescoes, in stained glass windows, in sculptures, in mosaics, and in illuminated Bibles and prayer books. Before turning to the reindeer herders and the story of Santa, let me show you a little bit about what we found. This is in a tiny church of Plain-Carrault in the center of France. I'm sorry, it's the Church of Saint Martin de Vic from about the 11th century. And as we stepped into the choir of this church, these frescoes, 1,000 years old, this one is a part of a Christology of the life of Jesus, shows Jesus sitting on the ass, entering Jerusalem. But if you'll notice, the joyful youth who are welcoming him to Jerusalem are not holding on to palm leaves. One of them is holding on to the stem of one of 5 tan, smooth, large psilocybin mushroom stems to a psilocybin mushroom cap. Now we have to remember that in Romanesque art, size matters. And the reason the artists put these mushrooms of this size is to tell us that these were significant. We turned to face the wall towards which Jesus was traveling, and it showed a fresco of the towers of Jerusalem. And up on top of these towers were similar youth using a long knife to cut through the stem, again, of large psilocybin mushrooms. If that were not enough, this painting of the towers of Jerusalem was right over a large fresco of the Last Supper. And there we see Jesus and his disciples, and on the table are the same large knives, and not loaves of bread, certainly not matzahs, which you would expect to find if this were a Passover Seder, and certainly not loaves of bread, which would have been ripped apart by hand in that time period, but mushroom caps. And as we show in the photographs in our book, The Psychedelic Gospels, there are many color plates. Cleverly depicted in the hems of the disciples are multiple mushroom caps. It was getting towards the end of the day. It was getting dusk. The church bell started to ring. We were kind of transported back into medieval times. And Julie and I had an aha moment. We said, this is an alternative gospel. This is a psychedelic gospel. This is a different master story of Christianity than the one that we've been taught in the canonic gospels. And this is not too surprising, because in the 6th century, Pope Gregory said, let art be the Bible of the illiterate. At this point, we had to check ourselves. We had to step back and we had to say, what's really going on here? We've seen these mushrooms here in central France, but is this a marginal Catholic cult? Are these some hippie priests operating and cavorting in the forest far from the crown and the church? We decided that we had to go to the high holy places of Christendom to see if we could find additional evidence of psychedelics, and that we did. We went to Canterbury Cathedral in England, and in this illuminated prayer book, and this is the front piece, the cover of our book. You've possibly seen this. This is on several book covers in the psychedelic literature.
Absolutely.
This is from an illuminated page, a drawing, bordered with gold. And this is from the story of Genesis. And here we have God creating plants. But wait a minute. What God is actually creating here are psychoactive mushrooms. There is a red and white Amanita mushroom. Here's a psilocybin mushroom, because as we know, psilocybin turns characteristically blue when exposed to oxygen, both psilocybin and psilocin. And there are other potential psilocybin mushrooms sort of holographically embedded in the caps. If this were not enough, in a few drawings later, they show us plants growing up between the mushrooms so that we know, the artists are telling us, we know what a plant is, we know what a tree looks like, and we know what a mushroom looks like, and here's the difference. Later on another page in the Great Canterbury Psalter, there's this incredible painting, this drawing again of Jesus healing the leper. Jesus has now been baptized. He is now on his healing journey.
Oh, yeah.
And in this, the Latin scrolls say, Jesus' scroll, which is coming out from his hand, says, may I heal you? And the leper, whose scroll does not to Jesus, but goes to the psilocybin mushroom in the base, says, Master, yes, you may cure me. And as we know, that psychedelics are very frequently used for healing around the world. We went to Chartres Cathedral, one of the great monuments and pilgrimage places in Christendom. And in the 176 stained glass windows of Chartres Cathedral, we found what could be psychoactive mushrooms in nearly 10% of the stained glass windows. This is the conversion of Placidus the Hunter to St. Eustace. We see the illuminating hand coming down through the concentric circles of heaven. We see the red and yellow mushrooms around him. And we see, so central to our story, the cross growing up between the antlers of the stag. Here is from an image, a ceiling painting of the Jesse tree in Hildesheim, in the Church of St. Michael in Hildesheim. And very often we know, it was a Benedictine order, or it was another order that created this. Here we actually know that this grew out of the legacy of Bishop Bernouard, who was very high in the Catholic Church. He was the tutor to Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor. And he was 100 years after his death, he was canonized as a Catholic saint. Bishop Bernouard was a brilliant man. He was a church builder. He was a mathematician. And here he was also a metallurgist. And he had two bronze works cast. One was bronze doors that told the story of the fall. The second was a Christ column, over 12 feet high, over 2 feet in diameter, and in a helix circle going around the column was the story of Jesus after his baptism to his entry into Jerusalem. And here, very significantly, in the transfiguration of Jesus, and this is one of the two places in the Bible where a miracle actually happens to Jesus rather than him performing a miracle. And here is where God intersects with humanity. And he says to the disciples who are standing under psilocybin mushrooms so distinctly drawn that ethnobotanists can tell the variety, verily I say to you, this is my son, hear him well. So it was out of this that we developed the theory of the Psychedelic Gospels. And we also now want to turn, I'd like to now turn to the reindeer shamanism that we believe holds the roots to our modern story of Santa. In doing that, I'd like to talk for a minute about shamanism. It's a word that's bandied about today. There are many people out there today who are leading a ceremony, calling themselves a shaman, who have none of the initiatory training or know very little about the sacred landscape in which shamans, which was the religion of our hunting and gathering forefathers throughout most of human history. Mircea Eliade, the great anthropologist, defined shamanism as archaic techniques of ecstasy, from the Greek word ekstasis, to put in motion. So it literally means ancient techniques for inspiring the flight of the soul. While shamanism grew up in many parts of the world, was decentralized, there was one principle essential to the worldview. There is the natural world that we observe through our senses, and then there is the supernatural world, the underworld, the overworld, the world of the ancestor, the world of the gods and goddesses, no matter how you call them in your variety of shamanism. And the role of the shaman is to travel into the supernatural world, to consort, to beseech, to placate the gods and goddesses, and in the words of Joseph Campbell in The Hero's Journey, to return and bring a boon, a gift, a benefit to mankind. Good hunt, healing, good crops, if that be the case. Finding of lost spirits to help people heal. Finding of things that have been stolen. Protection from the enemy. And this is the role of the shaman. And very often, the shaman is called to shamanism and goes through an initiatory crisis. It may be, as in certain Mexican peoples, indigenous peoples, he's almost struck by lightning. It may be among Inuit people, he goes through a severe illness that can only be cured through shamanism. And in one of the most dramatic initiatory experiences, I recommend to you very highly Michael Harner, experience with ayahuasca in the way of the shaman. It is one of the most dramatic experiences, near-death experiences and initiations into shamanism that you will ever read about. And it caused Dr. Harner to leave his teaching post at the New School of Social Science in New York and become a teacher of shamanism, which he is very successfully to this day.
It's great because you do hear a lot of those near-death experiences mirroring a lot of those intense ayahuasca experiences. When I've worked with patients who are dying, oftentimes they have these similar experiences when it's a prolonged death phase. So it's not a sudden death. People sometimes will have a psychedelic type of symptomology come over them. I'm not sure if you've heard many stories of that yourself, but they do mirror a lot of ayahuasca experiences when you hear them.
Yes, I have, and I know you have a vast experience with this. I want to turn now to the Siberian reindeer herders, often known as the fathers of shamanism. And in the first part of our book, we summarize the work of R. Gordon Wasson, one of the founders of modern ethnomycology. He did classic work. He identified in his 1968 book, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, the enigmatic plant in the Hindu Rig Veda, the Soma of the Hindu Rig Veda, as Amanita muscaria. He and his co-authors, the eminent classicist Carl Rook, and of course, Saint Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD or synthesized it in 1938 in his laboratory at Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, and actually experienced it 5 years later in 1943. Together, they unveiled the mystery of Eleusis, and they were able to decipher what was the psychoactive potion in the Kikion that was taken in the Eleusinian mysteries, which is a form of shamanism. But this was no backwoods shamanism. This was practiced at what today is a major archaeological site that you can visit 14 kilometers west of Athens at Eleusis. And Albert Hoffman identified that there was an LSD-like fungus that grew on the rye and barley that was used in the mixture to create the potion, the Kikion, that was given to the participants by the Hierophants of Eleusis. He also did phenomenal work with Maria Sabina, the famous, world famous perhaps, Mazatec shaman, whereas going down there in the early 50s, he was the first Westerner to actually participate in her all-night healing ceremonies, veladas, with the landslide mushrooms. When Wasson was doing this research, he also uncovered the Siberian Reindeer Herder shamanism complex. At that time, he had to rely on folk tales and linguistic evidence. He traced back the Uraltic languages and found that the word pang, the root word pang, stood for both mushroom and intoxication. And summarizing his conclusions, Wasson wrote, and I quote, "In a word, my belief is that Soma is the divine mushroom of immortality, and that in the early days of our culture, before we made use of reading and writing, when the Rig Veda was being composed, the prestige of this miraculous mushroom ran by word of mouth far and wide throughout Eurasia, well beyond the regions where it grew and was worshipped." Now, what Wasson did not know about at the time he was doing this research was there was a Russian archaeological group headed by Ditkov, who was also studying these petroglyphs that were made by the Chukotka people in Siberia. And these are the Pegmentel petroglyphs, rock carvings, where we see the mushroom-headed people at times in various stages of dance. We see the mushroom is either attached to their head, it is enlarged, they're, according to Wasson, in an ecstatic trance, and they're also touched by the little spirits or helpers of the mushroom people. And we know that from Strassman's work with DMT, we know that with other people's research, and even in my own experience with psychoactive mushrooms taken in Jamaica, I have seen these little people come down to initiate me into a particular experience that I had, a powerful experience I had with psilocybin in Jamaica that I describe in the book. These are the little elves that reside within the mushrooms, according to Siberian shamanism, that become the helpers. These go back, these petroglyphs, about 1,000 years. Excuse my coughing, I've been in a smoke zone for almost a week now. And they also show on monoliths, stone monoliths in Mongolia, flying reindeer. Now, why do we say that all of the modern themes of Santa Claus can be traced back to this, to the Amanita practice? First of all, the Christmas tree, the center of the Santa Claus story. The Amanita live and thrive in a symbiotic relationship with conifers and birches. That means that their spores grow in the decaying humus of the fir needles, of the pine cone needles. As they decay on the forest floor, and then after rain and often accompanied by lightning, the Amanitas spring up almost as overnight. How does Santa Claus dressed? And he's always been depicted, even way before Coca-Cola started using him in their ads in the 1930s. He's always depicted in a red suit trimmed with white. These are obviously the colors of the Amanita. The ornaments on the Christmas tree, even today, out in the Kamachkal Peninsula, there are about 30 reindeer herder groups left in the world today, stretching all the way from Siberia to central Russia, all the way to Scandinavia. About 300,000 people broken into about 30 different linguistic groups. Even today, some of them characteristically put on red and white dotted shirts or robes or dresses when they go out and hunt for the Amanita. As they collect them, they put them to dry in the branches of the conifer trees under which they grow as the shaman continue to harvest these. And then when they have enough of them, they put them in a bag, they put them in their sleigh, which are pulled back by reindeer to their tribal group. And these are nomadic people, they're reindeer herders. They live, they breathe, they eat from the reindeer. The reindeer provide them everything. Their clothing, their antlers become tools. Their milk becomes nourishment. And so now we have the reindeer pulling the gifts back to the village. And so they're led by Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, not the green-nosed reindeer, not the purple-nosed reindeer, but Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer. Very often in snowdrifts, the opening to the yurts are closed. So the shaman has to come down through a hole in the top. And then the mushrooms are additionally dried around the fireplace. So we have the placing of gifts around the fireplace. Certainly, there are other stories involved with Santa, his Teutonic roots in Altahirne, in Hold Neckar, certainly the Turkish St. Nicholas that was brought into Christianity. Certainly some people depict him as the last of the wild men, the last of the shaman, and part of the pagan Christmas. And obviously Coca-Cola resurrected this image in a 1933 ad, making Santa Claus, who is sometimes depicted as Krampus, a more diabolical figure, as friendly, plump with the white beard and drawn in a variety and in kind ways. Let me start to wrap this up, Bradley, by making a couple of observations. One of the things that people like to talk about are what are the real famous landmarks in the study of psychedelics and culture? Certainly, we could talk about Albert Hofmann's synthesis of LSD in 1938. Certainly, we could talk about Wasson's discovery of Soma in the Hindu Rig Veda in 1968. I'm sure anyone who studied this area could come up with their own favorite landmarks, and we can add some modern landmarks such as Dr. Griffiths at Johns Hopkins work starting in 1999 when he lifted the veil after the blackout from the Nixon's Controlled Substances Act and started the first approved research on psilocybin, which we hear so much about, the powerful results that it's having with terminal cancer patients. We hear as part of the many breakthroughs happening in the psychedelic renaissance. My favorite landmark is a conversation across the disciplines that happened between anthropologist Weston LaBarre and the famous ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes. And the question was this: why are, in the contemporary world, so many psychedelic plants in use in the New World, in the Americas, in North and South America, and so few in the Old World? Certainly, the Old World was populated longer. It has a larger landmass. It has all the varieties of climates. And the reason that is given is because the people who came across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, when Alaska and Siberia through the Kamchatka Peninsula were connected, brought this religion in which the Amanita Muscaria was central. And when they lost access to it coming out of the Canadian Rockies and the US Rockies, to have a portal to the supernatural was so important that they continued to explore. And they found peyote. And as we know, peyote is very bitter tasting. But they tasted the peyote and they persevered and they enjoyed mescaline, which is the most prevalent of the 30 alkaloids in peyote. They certainly found the psilocybin mushrooms. They certainly, as early chemists, learned to combine the two plants, the Banisteriopsis caapi and the Viridius, to make the ayahuasca brew, which has an analog over in the Middle East. And so what we can say here is that the magical religious use of psychedelic plants by American Indians represents a survival from a very ancient Paleolithic and Mesolithic Stone Age time, 4 or 5, 10,000 years ago, of a shamanistic stratum that goes all the way back in a linear relationship to the Eurasiatic, fly agaric, Amanita Muscaria cults that have survived in Siberia to the very present. Once we open the door to revisiting Santa and understanding the true story of Santa, we can also look at other myths. And I'll conclude with this observation. In the small chapel of Plaincaralt in central France, Julie and I mean small, 20 feet wide by 60 feet deep, and on the wall of the back of this chapel, we see this drawing of a giant Amanita muscaria mushroom. And I say giant, again, in Romanesque art, size matters. And there's Adam and Eve standing on each side. And what we notice is they're not covering themselves with fig leaves, they're covering themselves with mushroom caps. And there are other Amanita growing out around it in a cluster. And if we look at Eve, we see that she is skeletonized. Her body is skeletonized, which means she's moving into a transcendental framework. Now I ask you, what is going on here in Genesis? And if we remember the story, and I invite you all to revisit Genesis because it is truly a phenomenal creation story. God said, look, you have everything you need, Adam and Eve. You never have to work. You never have to go to school. You don't have to pay taxes. I give you dominion over everything, except there's one thing. There's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center of this garden. Of that ye shall not eat, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, then surely ye shall die. We all know the story. But what's going on here? Centuries later, Christian fathers interpreted this as a story of the fall of man and the need for redemption. But there is another way to interpret it. If we see that the tree of good and knowledge of good and evil, which is not identified, the tree in the Garden of Eden is we're never told that it's an apple tree, that it's a pear tree, that it's an actual tree. We're never told. If we see, as this painting suggests, that it is an Amanita muscaria mushroom, then that kind of stands the story of Adam and Eve on its head. Because look, Eve took of the tree on the invitation of the serpent, the wiliest of all creatures, and she had a transcendental experience. The serpent said, you will not die, you will become like the gods. And then she invited Adam to partake of it, and they didn't die. What is going on that God did not kill them? Is this really a story about taking the pathway to higher consciousness? And if it is, then this is not about the weakness of women, the beginning of the battle of the sexes, the foible of women to allow evil to seduce her. This is really a story about woman leading man spiritually to higher consciousness. And we can take this one step further to say that if this is all true, if this reinterpretation of Eden within the perspective of the Psychedelic Gospels is true, then we have resolved a problem that has plagued Jewish and Christian theologians for centuries. And that is this: how could evil in the form of the serpent come into the Garden of Eden, into God's perfect creation at the very beginning? It doesn't make sense if God is all powerful. But if this is really a story about our psychedelic roots and the use of psychedelic plants to transcend, then we can certainly reinterpret. I suggest that we need to revisit these myths and stories and place them in the context of the larger arc of the need to reclaim humanity's vast and ancient psychedelic history as our own, and to integrate it into the psychedelic renaissance. And here I would quote George Orwell from 1984, who said, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." So I invite you all, as part of this psychedelic renaissance and through your psychedelic societies, to help us to reclaim the present, the past, and the future. Let me truly conclude by saying that obviously psychedelics have posed religious and political problems throughout the human experience. They are suppressed as taboo in the Garden of Eden. They are demonized as the tools of Satan and satanic witches during the Inquisition. And they were certainly banned as having no redeeming properties in the 1970s. And that ban lasted for decades. How many times does a scientific civilization actually ban research? It is time to lift those bans and to enjoy this second coming of psychedelics, if you'll excuse the pun, with an open heart and an open mind. If you find what I'm talking about to be of interest, I invite you to read our book, The Psychedelic Gospels. It's available on Amazon. One reviewer called it, it's the Da Vinci Code meets the electric acid Kool-Aid test. And James Fadiman, one of my heroes in the whole field of research here, the most famous researcher on microdosing through his website, microdosingpsychedelics.com, and the author of the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, said, "What a gentle, careful, scholarly, personal, and altogether splendid book." I hope you will get a chance to enjoy it. I want to say to Bradley and to all of you, for my generation, starting out in our own little exploration of psychedelics in the 60s and 70s, it is incredibly gratifying to see this rebirth and re-legitimization of interest in psychedelics. And we know from marijuana that legalization follows medicalization. And I believe that the important work that you're doing, Bradley, and many others at the forefronts of the medical and scientific research will eventually lead either medically and or through the First Amendment to the legalization of psychedelics so that we can explore them for creativity, spiritual, and religious purposes. Thank you very, very much. And I'd be happy to take a couple of minute break and see what kind of questions that people have.
Dr. Brown, we have our first question from right here in Toronto, from Dennis.
Thank you very much for the interesting insight into the origins of sun. I'm from Siberia, and it happens so like we had a school reunion with my friends. It's like been 20 years, and we have like a small chat group, and everyone is joking about alcohol and stuff. And I asked them, like, why is it so that alcohol is so popularized psychoactive substance? And do you know of any other alternative to this? And originally, when I was there, I saw people like selling Amanita Muscaria next to like from their stands somewhere like outside on the street. I didn't know what it was for, but then I reminded them about the Amanita Muscaria and shamanic traditions, but no one heard of them. And we are all educated that these are just poisonous mushrooms. And basically no one knew about them. And I just like made the introduction. And my question is, what's happening there right now? Like if you know of any shamanic traditions that's still using the Amanita Muscaria in Siberia, and are they still alive?
Yes, absolutely. It is still being used today. What happened was through the period of the Soviet Union, when they were trying to build the new socialist man and integrate all of the peoples into socialist society, the motto was vodka see, mushrooms no, so to speak. So these practices, to the extent that they came in contact with Soviet officials, were suppressed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been a revitalization of the interest in these cultures. And there are groups everywhere from the Ostyuk and the Vogel, from the Ob and Yenisei River areas in central Russia, all the way out to the Kamchatka Peninsula above Korea, where these are still practiced. And every year, if you Google mushroom ceremonies or shamanic ceremonies, you will find that there is an annual festival in which some of the reindeer herding tribes come together and share mushrooms and share music and share stories and folklore and share arts and things that they make. So it has gone through a revival period without a doubt. Unlike the ayahuasca shamanism, which has really exploded out of the Amazon in the last years with ecotourism of people coming to the Amazon and shamans from the Amazon, from the Shipibo and Conibo and other groups actually traveling up through California, the West Coast, or over to Europe to conduct ayahuasca ceremonies. It is still a very difficult area to travel to and to get to. So it does not have that sort of exposure, but it is alive and well, and it is being practiced today as it was practiced for centuries and thousands of years in that area of the world. And it is in a way part of the Siberian heritage. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
We have a question right now from Boston. This is from Paige. She's a clinical pharmacist in Boston and member of the Boston Entheogenic Network. How do you suggest we best medicalize or synthetic psilocybin while respecting the natural entheogen?
I think that obviously the path that has been advocated by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which probably most of you are aware of, and their conference, Psychedelic Science, every 4 years, is one of the best places, if not the best place on earth, to get all of the cutting, to be exposed to the people who are doing all of the cutting edge research. In fact, the recent MAPS conference that took place in April of this year, all of their presentations are on video. Similar work is being done by the Beckley Foundation. And what Rick Dobin, the president of MAPS, and many other of the scientists realized that the most secure way and the most compelling way to overcome the taboos and the mistakes of the 1960s and the politicalization of these drugs that happened under the Nixon administration is through the medical model, and to go through the laborious and time-consuming and rigorous process that other drugs go through of clinical trials 1, 2, and 3 until they receive FDA approval. And we are going to see, we see that MDMA has recently been fast-tracked for use in dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome. In other words, psychedelic assisted therapy for veterans and other first responders who are suffering from tremendous stress and who have not responded to regular treatment. NYU, Johns Hopkins, and others are at the forefront of this research. This is the way in which medicalization is going to eventually lead to legalization. In Oregon right now, on the ballot for next year is the Psilocybin Services Initiative, which will again legalize psilocybin as prescribed by a physician for a variety of ailments. We have seen the MDMA used for post-traumatic stress syndrome. We've seen that Roland Griffiths and his colleagues, Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins and his colleagues at NYU, have had phenomenal results in using psilocybin with terminal cancer patients to overcome anxiety and depression. And when I say phenomenal results, I mean in 1 or 2 psychedelic assisted therapy sessions, 80 to 85% of the people have reduced anxiety, reduced fear, use less pain-killing medications. And this is a phenomenal discovery, given that normal antidepressants, they have tremendous side effects, and you have to take them regularly. So Big Pharma is certainly not going to like these results. They're probably going to be integrated through a public service kind of corporation. And one of the most remarkable things that came out of Roland Griffiths' work in the research was, he said, look, when you see patients who've been so beaten down by a devastating illness like cancer, that after these sessions, they are revitalized to the point that they are giving comfort to their relatives and their caregivers, telling them that everything is going to be all right. Even we researchers have to step back and have a sense of awe.
Absolutely.
That said, and I have nothing but the greatest respect for the work that the Beckley Foundation and MAPS and others are doing to legalize psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and we will see this happening in the next few years. We will see psychedelic psychotherapy centers in a neighborhood, near you. But where I ask, and we ask this in our book, where does that leave the 26 million other people who've used LSD in the United States alone, not to even mention around the world? Where does this leave the people who, like Steve Jobs, who loved LSD, used it for creativity, said it was one of the 2 or 3 most significant things in his life that allowed him to think different in the creation of Apple? And we can also refer, as we do in our book, to Jim Fadiman's pioneering work on psychedelics and problem solvings, in which 80% of the scientists who participated in his research had a breakthrough in a problem that they had not been able to solve, a mathematical problem, an architectural problem, a chemical problem, for 6 months. Where does that leave the rest of us who don't need it for psychotherapy? I believe that we need to recreate, as the Greeks did, sacred centers, and that these psychedelics should be legalized for personal exploration, creativity, and spiritual and religious purposes under the First Amendment of the US Constitution and under the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which has made it legal for the some 300,000 Native Americans who are part of the Native American church that use peyote, which has made it legal for the branch of Santo Daime in the United States to use ayahuasca. And I believe that this creates a legal framework along with the medical framework for eventually legalizing these substances as a right of religious freedom, where responsible adults who don't have psychological problems can take them with the availability of a trained guide if they so prefer. I think it's a very exciting time to be involved in this research. I know there are certain universities that are already certifying people to assist in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and it is one of the most significant developments that have come about in psychedelics in the recent years.
We have one about the Amanita Muscaria experience. This one's from Kitchener, Ontario. And could you please describe the qualities of experience modern people report with Amanita?
As a preface to that, some people ask me, and I've experienced both Amanita Muscaria and psilocybin. And people say, well, you know, what is the results? What are the experiences? And to that, I have to answer that you can say what people generally report, but we have to remember that with any entheogen, with any substance that has the potential to generate the divine within or to create an altered state of consciousness, that experiences can be very individualized. They depend obviously on the mental set that you bring to the psychedelic, the setting in which you are taking it. You know, if you're on Times Square in New York, you're gonna have a very different experience than if you're high in the Canadian Rockies. And also dose. Dose is extremely important. One of the things Hoffman learned about LSD was that it was effective at 1/1,000,000th of a gram. And he couldn't believe it. He had to test this several times because there was no known other psychedelic that could be that powerful. And when he submitted his report to the directors of Sandoz, and I just need a pause here, because anyone reading in this field, I highly recommend Albert Hoffman's LSD, My Problem Child. It's one of the great books on this subject. And his directors at Hoffman said, at Sandoz said, have you checked your results? So we see that in the 60s and 70s, people were all chasing the heroic dose, the mega dose that would give the sort of the God particle, the spiritual experience. When it comes to microdosing, that is being researched and advocated by Paul Austin through the Third Wave website, and certainly through Dr. Fadiman through his microdosing psychedelics website. Now we're talking about taking 1/10 of a normal dose. You know, maybe 10 micrograms of LSD in a microdosing experience, which Rolling Stone wrote up as the drug that your employer would like you to take because it makes you more creative, sharper, and more productive. Certainly with Amanita Muscaria, very generically, the experience of synesthesia and microscopia is reported. You can feel very small. You can feel very large. I can pick up the earth and put it here or there.
When Alice in Wonderland, she bites one side of the mushroom, she grows larger. The other side, she shrinks.
Exactly, as Jefferson Airplane said.
Yes.
And so you have that experience. You can have the experience of meeting the spirits that live within the mushrooms. And one of the things that that Maria Sabina, in her chants, when she would do her veladas, and she would talk in her chants, she would sing her chants. At the end of every sentence, she would say in the Mazatec language, mushroom says. In other words, it's not me speaking, it's the mushroom speaking. And I'd like to just probe this a little further, because I do agree with Paul Stamets that these mushrooms, which came to Earth 1.4 billion years ago, is when we find the beginning of the mushroom kingdom, which is different than the plant or the animal kingdom. Some of these are obviously sentient beings that we can interface with. We're always looking for intelligent life out in space and looking for the aliens to show up. Well, I would suggest that this intelligent life is around us, and that the portal into the mushroom world. Obviously, in the therapeutic experience, where someone is looking for relief from a devastating illness or from a trauma, the kind of experience that they're going to have, that's going to let them go back and relive that trauma without being doubly traumatized, but almost being able to see it objectively as an observer in their own life. This is another quality. People also often talk about going into mythopoetic times where you are feeling, you are living or experiencing, or you actually see, as Campbell would describe it, the myth that you are living, the story that you are weaving in your own life. And in some of those rare cases, Stanislav Grof, one of the other people, along with Jim Fadiman, who are among the most, have decades and decades of experience in leading LSD psychotherapy. His very first experience in the laboratory in Prague with LSD, he had a cosmic consciousness experience. He had a unity experience in which he went back to the very foundations of the cosmos. So I believe that the experience is very varied. There are some obviously altered states of consciousness, alteration of time, alteration of space, moving into other dimensions and other realities, as Dr. Strassman has described in DMT, the spirit molecule. But I also believe it's very individualized. My first LSD experience, I was in a tumultuous time in my life. I knew my marriage was falling apart. I had moved out of a cause that was kind of giving my life a lot of purpose. I was kind of lost, and it was a frightening experience. Later experiences were much more satisfying in terms of giving me a sense of connectedness and purpose. So it really depends, and I think that Jim Fadiman's The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide provides great guidance to anyone who's got questions about or thinking about exploring psychedelics and has questions about them. I think, to step back from the question, what psychedelics can do for us is give us a sense of connectedness that is so missing in the modern world, of our sense of our place in the greater cosmos, and the realization that we are a strand in an incredible fabric of life that is not given to us in a psychedelic experience as something we talk about, but something we grok, something we experience existentially and come away from with a deep knowing, what in German would be a sense of Ich kenne das. I know it, not I don't know it intellectually, but I know it in every cell in my body. So I've gone through maybe too long of an explanation here, but I wanted to, it's a very important question.
My name is Hector Maldonado. I'm a creator of Shamanic Fellowship of Orlando and have started using Amanita religiously and look to become recognized by local politics. Why do you think Amanita has not become anywhere near as popular in America for religious reasons as it has never become illegal?
It's unlike psilocybin, it is not easily cultivated. Right. One of the great things that the brothers McKenna, both Dennis and Terrence, gave us was the tools to cultivate and propagate psilocybin. So psilocybin has gone from the woodlands and the forests and the dung heaps of Florida, the cow manure pastures of Florida, out throughout the world. It is extremely widely distributed. It is extremely widely researched. Amanita is not so easily propagated if at all. It is also surrounded by some, as I've said, of in the Amanita family, some of the most toxic mushrooms in the world, particularly Amanita phaliotis, which is a neurotoxin that can kill you. So while Amanita muscaria is very lumped in as toxic and deadly in even some mushroom field guides, it is not at all the case, but it is much more difficult for the amateur mushroom hunter to identify and to find. I taught Hector for many years. I was a founding professor of anthropology at Florida International University, a state school in Florida. And I know all too well the politics of the state of Florida, where the governor has banned any discussion of climate change in public documents and reports. So you've got a very rough road in terms of legalization in this discussion in the state of Florida. So I think I've addressed, I could go on and on, but for a variety of reasons of the way it grows, where it grows, the parts of the world it grows in, the other toxins in that, in the Amanita group, it is just much more easy to find, propagate, ingest psilocybin. And that was well known, and that got to be very much on the radar of the drug enforcement people, along with LSD, along with MDMA, and that even though the researcher and the administrator who reviewed MDMA said he did not recommend banning it, but letting it be used for research purposes and therapeutic purposes, the political appointee put it on the schedule. I want to make another point here that I think is important. And this was told by one of President Nixon's closest associates as to why these substances were banned. Nixon had a vast political problem. He had a powerful civil rights movement, and he had a powerful anti-war movement. And as this lieutenant of Nixon said, we couldn't make it illegal to be black, and we certainly couldn't make it illegal to protest the war. But by making cannabis and these other drugs illegals, we gave ourselves and law enforcement the tools to devastate the leadership, to invade people's homes, to incarcerate hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, we have, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in prison in the United States, which has the largest prison population in the world, larger than communist China, for drug related. And we hope that as the medicalization goes forth, that many governors of states who are facing the problems of overcrowding in the prison systems will say, look, we need to decriminalize these substances. We need to identify the people who are not harmful to themselves or society, who are involved with the law, which is what a victimless crime has been. And I think in time, the current Attorney General of the United States notwithstanding, that cooler heads will prevail, and we will see this decriminalization and legalization come about. I'd like to point out that the country of Portugal, which in 2001 decriminalized all drugs, put the money for heroin addicts and other addicts into prevention and into rehabilitation. It has been, contrary to what the war on drug people said, their dire predictions, it has become a tremendous success. Addiction-related diseases, addiction has declined, crime has declined, and Portugal can serve as a model to the world as to where we can move boldly into a sane and reasonable and healthy future as far as psychedelics and other helpful drugs are concerned.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful pathway that's being carved out nowadays, and I think we're going down the right path, so to speak. This next question here is actually a really good one for the science side of things. Does drying fully convert ibotenic acid to muscimol? Are there other ways to decarboxylate ibotenic acid? And is there a way to check to see if the full conversion's taken place?
Okay. The research that I've read, and I cannot answer that question completely. We know there are people who have eaten Amanita muscaria in the raw and have not had a psychedelic experience. Obviously, the drying of the mushroom adds to the conversion. And the data that I've seen is that drying makes it 4 or 5 times more powerful than when taken. We remember that from the Rig Veda, which obviously is not a scientific, but more a poetic document, they talked about taking it in 3 ways. 1, eating Soma itself, taking the dried Soma, or drinking the urine of someone who had. So I cannot cite other scientific papers, but we do know that drying the Amanita muscaria does make it 4 or 5 times more potent than it is in the raw form for the conversion into muscimol.
And I would just like to prompt, if the group from Victoria is listening, if you have any questions you'd like to share in the chat there, feel free to post those, and I'll address you guys first from Victoria. Also, just while they're doing that, the last part of that question was they were asking the danger of muscimol and ibotenic acid. Is there much literature on the lethal dose or the harmful side effects at all, or does it seem to be fairly new still?
One of the things that can happen, certainly, and the reason they call it Fliegenpilze in German, is because it can put a person into a deep sleep state, and where they appear almost comatose. And this is what happens to the flies. So they would use it to kind of chill out, the flies in an area. There have been, to get a toxic from, one of the first steps in the clinical trials is always toxicity. At what dose can any particular substance have toxic or harmful side effects? And one would have to consume massive superhuman doses of Amanita or other psychedelics to have those kinds of effects. But in the kinds that people can take, there have been no known in the literature toxicities from the Amanita muscaria.
My question is in regards to other species of Amanita that contain muscimol, such as Amanita panteria, and whether or not there's any history or writings related to this other species of mushroom.
Yes, there are. And for that, I would refer you to what I consider one of the Bibles of psychedelics, Plants of the Gods by Richard Evans Schultes and Albert Hoffman. This book, Plants of the Gods, is extremely useful because it presents the biology, the chemistry, the effects, and maps of the distribution of each of these numerous psychedelics. And it gives a column for a description of each, the different varieties of Amanita, and allows you to trace all of the known literature. Now, it was written a while ago. You can find updates on some of it, but this is an excellent place to look at that and any Amanita-related substances. Thank you.
Coming from Victoria again, I would love to know about the psychoactive content of Muscaria mycelium. I have researched recipes for ambrosia and wonder if this is a valid approach.
I can't really comment on that. I'm not familiar with that particular aspect of it. And are you talking about Amanita mycelium, or are you talking about psilocybin mycelium?
Oh, they're specifically the Muscaria mycelium there, the Amanita.
Yeah, I can't comment on that. I'm sorry.
Is there anyone else there, now that you do have your audio feed there in Victoria, anyone else have a question from the Victoria group? Oh, there we go. Oh, is anybody, oh, I see a hand in the back. Did you have a question? Just wonderful. Oh, here's a new one in from Orlando here. All right. And you know what? I was waiting for someone to kind of bring this up. Besides mainstream commercialism controlling capitalistic culture, Do you think American culture will ever change this false holiday? Most biblical scholars conclude the falseness of December's Jesus' birth. So I don't know if you have anything to comment on that.
You know, I think that beyond that, in the way that Christmas has been commercialized in the United States, that it is a time of year, and I don't think we're going to get rid of it anytime in the near future. I think it's one of the great feel-good times of the year. I think it's when people really come together with friends and family and celebrate, and the feeling of warmth and gift giving. And I think that transcends, I mean, it certainly is on many of the themes of love, compassion, and kindness that Jesus expressed, certainly in the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the many reasons of the attractiveness of the Catholic religion and all of the wonderful things, and I'm not talking about the Inquisition period, obviously, but many of the wonderful things that Catholicism has done through its services to the poor and the needy throughout the world. But I think Christmas and the spirit of Christmas certainly transcends that. And as you look around you and as you prepare for Christmas, and certainly a lot of people are turned off by the commercialism, but people find their own ways to celebrate that spirit and to come together. And, you know, we've just gone through in Southern California a horrific time where people have literally, you know, lost their homes, 200,000 people evacuated. And what people say is, you know, even if I lost everything, I see the love of my friends, my family, and my community. And that's what Christmas is really all about. I think there's another thing here. And I don't think we talk about this enough. And that is the wellspring of love, the feeling that some of us get that if our hearts have been closed down, if we've been traumatized, if we're so overly socialized that we don't dare love enough and express loving kindness enough to the people that we know and care about, that I know, certainly for myself and certainly for many others I know, and perhaps for some of you, this tapping into this sense of a wellspring, a river of love, almost as if God was a river of love that flows through the universe, that psychedelics opens up for many of us and gives us the hope that that spirit can not only prevail in ourselves, in our relationships, in our psychedelic communities, but is something that can be a candle that can be kept lit throughout the world. And I think that's where Christmas and psychedelics really harmonizes. Look, it took 300 years for the church to apologize to Galileo. I don't think that psychedelics is basically inconsistent with Catholic practice. In fact, in our book, we quote Brother David Stendhal Rast, a Catholic of the Order of St. Benedict, who says, if I can experience God through a sunset on a mountaintop, why not through a mushroom prayerfully ingested?
I think that's a beautiful statement. And I mean, there are a lot of allusions to the mushroom caps being the original sacrament in Christianity instead of the crackers or the wafers they use now. So I find that an illusion.
Yeah, and that's where we go. Look, there is no, for a variety of reasons, there is no Christian art before the year 200. Poverty, horrible persecution by the Romans, the lack of buildings and churches in which to create the art or to display the art. So once we got back beyond 200, 300 AD, we had to go back to scripture. And we had to look at both the canonic Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels through the eyes of the Psychedelic Gospels and say, are there passages here that could be interpreted to show that Jesus and or his disciples were aware of psychedelics? And we certainly believe there are. Certainly when Jesus says, drink of my blood and eat of my flesh and you will achieve immortality, he certainly wasn't talking about cannibalism. This would have been repugnant, blasphemy, anathema to both Romans and Jews alike, and all of the early Christians were Jews. There are passages in the Gnostic Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas, which are available in English today, the 52 Gnostic Gospels in the Nag Hammadi Library, where Jesus says to his disciples, "Who can you compare me to?" And Thomas says, "Oh, Master, there's no one I can compare you to." And Jesus says, "No, because you have drunk from the drink that I have measured out, you have become like me, and I have become like you, and everything that is within is revealed." In other words, the kingdom of heaven is within. And here Jesus is talking about a drink, a potion that he has measured out. In other words, he knows the dose. So while we do not have, nor do we ever claim to have a smoking gun of the use of entheogens from the life of Jesus, I mean, a literal smoking gun in scripture or in drawing from that time, we certainly think there is strong indirect evidence. And why not? Because Christianity arose in a circum-Mediterranean area that was rife with mystery cults like the Eleusinian mysteries, like the Therapeuti, like the Essenes, and groups that had a vast knowledge of an entheogenic pharmacopoeia. So it's certainly not out of the question. We also have the fact that in modern research, such as the miracle of Marsh Chapel, the Good Friday experiment done in 1962 at Marsh Chapel at Boston, Walter Pankey proved through experimental double-blind control research that ingesting psychedelics could create a full-blown mystical experience. And Houston Smith, the famous professor of religion who died not too long ago, who was a participant in that experience, said it was the most powerful cosmic homecoming I'd ever experienced. And so we see that certainly these substances, if they could have created a mystical experience or an experience of Jesus for those people of the Catholic faith, of literally seeing Jesus or experiencing him or merging with him as a spiritual guide, certainly this would have been an initiatory secret perpetrated throughout early and medieval Christianity. And we make a strong point in our book that secrecy does not mean suppression. These things were not suppressed until the Middle Ages.
I think another thing.
I'm sorry, until the Inquisition.
Oh, yes. I wondered if you heard much about the work of John Marco Allegro. And he was originally going through the Dead Sea Scrolls and finding some of those pieces that can be translated from Aramaic over into English. He was the only, I believe, he was the only agnostic one on the council. So he was the one who continued that search down the rabbit hole. And I see that as another person where you're also doing your own research and it's kind of fitting together as a nice puzzle piece.
Yeah. I have, John Marco Allegro, and you can read about him in The Scholar of the Maverick of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a biography written by his daughter, Judith Brown, no relationship to me. When he published in 1970, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, that book destroyed his career. The entire Catholic Church of England, the Church of England came down on him. And there were three problems with his research. Number one, he used a lot of very dubious linguistic research in which he would take a word and maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 of the letters were missing, and he would speculate on what that was. So even philologists, and he was an eminent philologist, claimed that his work would not hold up under scrutiny. Number two, he really had an axe to grind against the Catholic Church and saw his work as liberating people from the thrall of a fake religion and mythology. And number three, he did not believe that Jesus was a historical person, but literally that he was the mushroom itself, and that the entire Old and New Testament was a secret code for the Amanita fertility cult.
So it seems like
that said, and that's quite a mouthful. I laud John Marco Allegro for his courage and his pioneering work, because he was one of the early people to look at the entheogenic origins of religion. And so And he had one image, that of the plain Chorale fresco, in his book. And his daughter said, had he had many more images of psychedelics in Christianity, maybe his work would have gotten more of a hearing. So we hope that his fundamental thesis, while we disagree with some of it, we believe Jesus was a historical figure. And we are not here to challenge anyone's belief. We hope that psychedelics will be integrated into Christianity. And this is not as far-fetched as you may think. For example, Santo Daime and the União de Vegetal in Brazil, these use a psychedelic, DMT, through ayahuasca, and this is approved by the Catholic Council of Bishops of Brazil. So we are seeing movement here. So basically, in a nutshell, I respect John Marco Allegro for what he did. I understand where his work went off course, and I hope that our work will reinvigorate interest in his basic thesis that entheogens were prevalent in the founding and evolution of many of the world's religions.
And the way you and your wife went about that research, especially, and are currently going about it, I find it does leave room for people to take it in a lot easier. You're not throwing it in people's face, like you're saying, trying to sway their opinions. You're just sharing these facts and allowing that method to integrate both systems and kind of giving that option instead of forcing people that this is one way and this is the other. And having all your visual pieces of evidence, I find, makes it way better than just text for a lot of people.
Well, you know, we put this out for public discussion for the scientific community. Part of the problem here is that art historians have no training in ethnobotany. So, for example, in the Church of St. Martin de Vic, a very eminent art historian analyzed that church, looked at those psilocybin mushrooms, and called them branches of a tree. In the cover of our book, an eminent art historian at Cambridge University, who wrote a commentary on the Great Canterbury Psalter, when I called his attention to these obvious mushrooms images in the creation scene of in God Creates Plants, he said, "Jerry, I wouldn't know a mushroom if I saw one." So what we're trying to do here is open up a dialogue. If someone has a better interpretation of what these multiple psychedelic images are doing in the 9 churches in the Middle East and in Europe that we saw, including in the ancient cave churches of Turkey, where early Christians fled as early as the 1st century to escape persecution, I'd love to hear it. Also, it's not just our work. There are multiple images of psychedelics in Christian art that have been discovered. And we called for the creation of an interdisciplinary committee on the Psychedelic Gospels to treat these discoveries as significantly as the Dead Sea Scrolls and as the Gnostic Gospels, and to bring these before the scientific community, put it all online, have a transparent discussion. But if it is verified, then this really causes us to revisit what we know about Christianity and to hopefully see an integration, a reintegration of psychedelics back into the human spiritual and religious experience. And we know that for many people in the younger generation, I mean, right now, the Pew Research Center, in its studies of religion, it finds that 20% of people in the United States consider themselves to be spiritual or not, but not religious. And when you go to younger people, 19 to 29 or 34, that goes up to 1/3, the largest number in history. And if psychedelics can reinvigorate and bring back and re-sacralize the experience of the divine for people who are even agnostic, and he can reintegrate that into a direct experience of the divine within a religious framework, whether it be Judaic, Christian, Islamic, or pagan, then I feel we are made a contribution to that discussion and are very happy to be involved in this conversation, and extremely grateful to you, women and men of the Psychedelic Society, for bringing about this conversation. I know there are psychedelic societies springing up all around the world. There's hundreds of them in the United States and Europe, and it's a very encouraging sign.
This one here is coming in from Orlando, Florida. So I have read an article proving frankincense burned is a psychoactive compound. How would the process be for the Catholic Church to recognize that?
That's a two-edged question. I really don't know what the process would be. I know that there is so in Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and I have time for about one more question after this, and I've got to get back on the road to get out of this fire smoke zone. But there is so Huautla de Jimenez in the state of Oaxaca is the center of the Mazatec indigenous culture, who have used psilocybin mushrooms from time immemorial. And they use it mainly for healing and for other benefits to the community. Maria Sabina, who was made famous through her chants and through her healing ceremonies, certainly helped people understand the ancient use of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, among the Aztecs, and the Mazatec certainly have similar healing ceremonies, and these Aztec ceremonies were documented by the Spanish chroniclers at the time of the conquest from 1519 to 1521 on. The point I want to make is that a local priest, a Catholic priest, has petitioned the Vatican with an online petition to allow him to use the little saints, the magic mushrooms, the psilocybin mushrooms, in the Catholic Mass in Huautla. So that might give us one indication of how the Vatican is going to respond to it. I think that if any pope be open-minded to it, it may be the current pope.
Dr. Brown, would you like to share any last parting words or anything to leave us with before we wrap up here?
I want to commend all of you who've taken your time to come here today. For all of you who are open-minded enough, adventurous enough to want to explore, either personally or through the literature, psychedelics, to educate yourselves, educate your community, and to walk down this road of advocating the legalization of psychedelics, both for medical and therapeutic purposes, which is well underway, and for more broadly for creativity and religious and spiritual purposes. Just look around you and realize that you're not alone anymore, that you and many others from my generation, your generation, are coming out of the psychedelic closet. And based on the kind of research we've done in the religious areas, that other phenomenal researchers are doing in the medical and scientific area, our time has come. And if we avoid the mistakes of the 1960s and 1970s of over-promising, of advocating use that can lead to irresponsible behavior and harm, I think we have a chance that when Americans and people all around the world and Canada see that these things can help people, cannabis and psychedelics, from migraine headaches to tremors, that the door is going to be open for a new conversation that is already taking place through the psychedelic renaissance. So I would conclude by applauding. I'd give you all, say, applaud yourself. Thank you for coming today. And let's continue the conversation with an open heart and an open mind. Thank you.
I love it. And thank you very much, Dr. Jerry Brown, for joining us and for all of your work that you and your wife continue to do. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here at U of T and everyone online. If you'd like, please check out the Toronto Psychedelic Society, the Psychedelic Society of First Responders and Emergency Workers, to get any more information. Also, that in January, we have that From Microdosing to Mystical Experiences symposia that will be happening as well. Thank you all and take care.